They don't make movie soundtracks anymore. I don't mean they make bad ones. I mean they don't make them anymore. That thing we grew up on, the soundtrack that was its own classic album, the one that you bought whether or not you saw the movie, that's basically gone. And most of us didn't even notice it leave. What happened to the hip-hop movie soundtrack? There was a time the soundtrack could launch careers, bring together artists you had never heard on the same album, and give you records you couldn't get anywhere else. It wasn't an afterthought. It was an event. So I pulled 5 of some of my favorite ones, not necessarily the 5 best, but 5 that show exactly what we've lost. And by the end of this video, I'll give you a better understanding of what I think actually disappeared. Let's get to it. Meet me on the other side.
I am Broadway, the lyricist, homie, just let me do my thing.
Now let's start with Above the Rim. The movie had Tupac, basketball, 90s New York, but this soundtrack, Death Row, was in its prime. Dr. Dre supervised the project. It included Snoop, Lady of Rage, The Dogg Pound, and then Warren G and Nate Dogg gave us Regulate. One of the defining records of that entire West Coast era wasn't introduced on Warren G's album. It came from a movie soundtrack. And I can't talk about this soundtrack without mentioning SWV's Anything All-Star remix with Wu-Tang. That was top tier hip hop and R&B coming together, and to this day, still one of my favorite records on that soundtrack. That soundtrack went double platinum and won Soundtrack of the Year at the Source Awards. And 30 years later, arguably has an even bigger musical legacy than the movie itself. That's how important these projects could be. And these soundtracks didn't just give established artists another place to make classic records. Sometimes they help introduce the next act, which is the perfect segue to drive us into our next soundtrack, New Jersey Drive. Total had already been introduced to listeners through appearances with Biggie, but Can't You See was their debut single, and it didn't come from a Total album. It came from the New Jersey Drive soundtrack. With Puff producing, Biggie on the intro, the record goes gold, and suddenly Total had their own hit before their debut album even arrived. And don't get it twisted, the hip-hop on this soundtrack was serious too. You had Redman's Where Am I, OutKast Benz a Beamer, Queen Latifah's Jersey, Keith Murray's East Left, plus records from Heavy D, MC8, and Lords of the Underground. That thing was stacked, but that's what soundtracks could be back then. Not just somewhere to dump leftover songs. They could be launching pads. You put developing artists next to established names, give them the right record, and suddenly everybody buying that soundtrack gets introduced to somebody new. And if you think a movie about stealing cars, launching an R&B group is random, wait until you see what they put on the soundtrack to a street ball documentary. Soul in the Hole. This one is for the heads right here. It's the soundtrack to a street ball documentary, but Loud Records stacked this thing with Wu-Tang, M.O.P., Organized Confusion, Common, and it had Big Pun's You Ain't a Killer. What's interesting is Soul in the Hole came out before Capital Punishment. So before You Ain't a Killer became part of Pun's classic debut album, it already had a home here, on the soundtrack to a basketball documentary. That's the kind of record you discover buying these things. And as a fun tidbit, Complex actually ranked Soul in the Hole number 20 on its list of 25 best hip-hop movie soundtracks. You know, if you're into those kind of lists. But Discovery was only part of it, because sometimes these soundtracks gave us collaborations that, at least for me, I hadn't heard anywhere else. Which brings me to Hoodlum. The record I always come back to is the title track. Mobb Deep, Big Noyd, and Rakim. Now I can't confirm whether this was actually the first time Mobb Deep and Rakim ever worked together, but I can tell you it was the first time I heard them together. And I always looked at this collaboration as kind of a confirmation that Mobb Deep was top tier by that point. And I'm not saying that Rakim passed them some ceremonial hip-hop torch, but there was something about hearing one of the architects rhyming side by side with one of the defining groups of that generation. And the reason we even got that combination? A movie soundtrack. That's what these albums could create. And apparently Mobb Deep liked the soundtrack thing too, because a year later, here they are again. Slam. This one's personal. The movie centers around a poet, a lyricist dealing with incarceration and trying to navigate his way through words. And look at the soundtrack they built around it. Mobb Deep shows up again, this time with Feel My Gap Blow. Big Pun shows up again. Q-Tip is on there. And one of my favorite joints on this soundtrack was N.O.R.E's Thug Poetry. N.O.R.E was on fire around this time. His solo album had just dropped. Super Thug was everywhere. And here's another record called Thug Poetry, sitting on a soundtrack to a movie centered around a poet. As Broadway the lyricist, come on, man. Of course I love this shit. But now look at all 5 of these albums together. different movies, different sounds, different artists, and yet they all demonstrate the same thing. The soundtrack used to be a destination. So if the artist didn't suddenly stop being talented and movies didn't suddenly stop needing music, how do we go from this to what we have now? Well, first, I need to clarify something I said at the beginning of this video. I want to clarify something I said earlier because hip-hop soundtracks technically didn't disappear. Movies still have music. Artists still make original records for movies. And every once in a while, we still get a soundtrack that becomes an event. So me saying they don't make soundtracks anymore isn't really the full extent. Something much more specific disappeared. Back then, the soundtrack could function as its own business. You had exclusive records, lead singles, music videos that tied into the movie, established artists sitting next to artists you might have never heard before. And most importantly, somebody was actually curating all of this into one project. You weren't buying one artist's album, you were buying a collection. And then the way we consume music changed. The album stopped being the center of the business model. Artists don't need a soundtrack to get an exclusive record in front of millions of people anymore. They can release it themselves. Discovery doesn't require you buying an entire compilation because you recognize the names on the back cover. And over time, the soundtrack stopped serving that same purpose. Which brings me to what I think actually disappeared. The hip-hop soundtrack didn't die. The various artists hip-hop compilation soundtrack did. And if you think I'm just splitting hairs with that distinction, look at the soundtracks we still celebrate today. Because that's where you can actually see the change. What we've lost was the compilation. Because we still gotten major hip-hop driven soundtrack projects. Kendrick gave us Black Panther, we had Judas and the Black Messiah, the Creed movies have produced major records and soundtrack projects. So clearly the concept isn't dead. But look at how the model evolved. A lot of the biggest modern examples are built around a central artist, producer, curator, or an established brand. That's different from walking into a record store and finding Mobb Deep, Rakim, Big Pun, Wu-Tang, N.O.R.E, Total, Warren G, Nate Dogg, and whoever else was scattered across these different compilations. And somewhere between track 4 and track 9 might be somebody you never heard of, until that soundtrack puts you onto them. That's the part I miss. Not because everything was magically better in 1997, and not because today's artists couldn't make records just as good. The function changed. These soundtracks used to create combinations. They created discovery. They gave records a home that sometimes didn't exist anywhere else. And sometimes the soundtrack became more important than the movie. So maybe we got to reframe the question a little bit. Not necessarily why don't they make good movie soundtracks anymore? Maybe it's did the soundtrack disappear, or did the way we consume albums change so much that we stopped needing what the soundtrack used to provide? Because I think it's the latter. And I think we lost something pretty dope along the way. But that's where I land. Now, I want to hear from you. Did I leave off any of your favorite soundtracks? Be sure to put them in the comments because I'm sure there's plenty I didn't get to. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. Click the bell icon so you guys get notified when I upload new content. And if you want to see more videos just like these, click here to see more. I'm Broadway the Lyricist. These are the hip-hop conversations we should be having. Thank you so much for watching. I truly appreciate y'all. Peace.